the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning.
Good morning.
When I was a brand new priest, and I was assigned to Houston, when I got to the city of Houston, one thing that really struck me about that city was that everywhere you would drive in the city, everywhere that you went, you would see very large groups of homeless people. They would set up camps underneath the overpasses of the highways, and you would see hundreds of tents set up in these camps. Before that, I was in Boston, and there were homeless people in Boston, but you didn't see nearly as many homeless people in Boston as you saw in Houston. And I was wondering about this. I was thinking about this as a new priest. I was thinking, why is it? Does Houston have a bigger rate? Are there more homeless people in Houston than in other cities around the same size? I did some research and found out there's not. Houston has a rate of homelessness that is about the same as other cities its size. In fact, Boston had a much greater rate of homelessness than Houston. I was thinking, why is it then that you see homeless people everywhere you go in Houston, whereas in Boston you didn't see that? And the reason I found out is that although Houston had a lower rate of homelessness than Boston, it had a much higher, in fact, one of the highest rates in the country of unsheltered homelessness. Meaning there weren't enough homeless shelters, there weren't enough places for these people to go at night to get meals, to get clean clothes, to get a clean bed. And so while there weren't as many homeless people, the homeless people that there were in Houston had no place to go, had no place to be safe from the incredible heat, the incredible rain that you saw in Houston. And this made me think about really a basic question for our faith. How do we as Christians, and how do we as the church, respond to the presence of need in God's creation? Last year in 2020, at the Patriarchate in Constantinople, a document was written that was approved by the Holy Synod in Constantinople that outlined the social teachings of the church, outlined everything that the church teaches on social ethics, what our duty is in creation to our fellow man. And a very long section of this document was dealing with the question of poverty, wealth, and need. I've included in your bulletin today some excerpts from that section of that document. And that document identified the one greatest injustice that is faced by the poor today. The one greatest evil that those who are in need face in our society today. And this document from the Patriarchate said that one greatest injustice, that one greatest evil is unrelieved hunger. Unrelieved hunger. And so we have to look, as we're struggling with this question of how we're supposed to respond as people of faith to the presence of hunger, to the presence of need, to the presence of poverty in our society. We have to look and see, how has the church throughout the ages dealt with this question? The church has, of course, a 2,000-year-old tradition, a 2,000-year-old history of struggling with these exact same problems. What do we see happening in the church throughout the ages? Well, in the early church, in the early centuries of the church, we see that the early Christians shared everything that they had. All the money that people took in from their jobs, all the food they were able to get from their farms, they shared that all among themselves. No one considered their earnings and their possessions to be their private property. Instead, everything that they had was given up for the good of the community. And because of that sharing, because of that life together that the early church lived, all people were cared for. All people were fed, especially the orphans, especially the widows, especially those people who had no way to care for themselves and nobody else to care for them. The church was there for those people in a very tangible, real way, putting food on the table for them. Now, in the 4th century, when the Roman Empire adopted Christianity under first St. Constantine, but then even more under his predecessors, or his successors, I should say, one of the changes that we saw in society in the Roman Empire was a greatly increased care for the poor, a greatly renewed sense that it is our duty to provide, both as individuals and as the Roman Empire, as the empire, to provide for those people who are in need, for the underprivileged of their time. There is, I would say, no better example of this change in the Roman Empire than St. Basil the Great. St. Basil the Great in the 4th century was bishop in the city of Caesarea in Cappadocia. And he ruffled some feathers. You know, if you think of many of the saints in the 4th century, John Chrysostom, for example, who were bishops, they weren't always very popular because they weren't afraid to preach the gospel with all of its very uncomfortable, sometimes, implications. And so, are we familiar with the idea of, if I use the word epithemion, do we know what that is, an epithemion? An epithemion is a penance. So, if someone has committed a particular sin, they'll be given an epithemion, a penance. And often that is a certain period of time away from Holy Communion, a certain period of time abstaining Holy Communion. The epithemion for somebody who has committed the sin of murder, okay, so probably one of the most severe sins we can think of. The Holy Canon say that a person who has committed that sin is supposed to spend 10 years away from Holy Communion. 10 years. They're not out of the church, they're still in the church, but they're supposed to abstain from communion for 10 years. Okay. So, St. Basil the Great was bishop in Cappadocia, and there was a period of time when there was a famine in Cappadocia. The fields were not producing the wheat that they're supposed to. There was a famine. And St. Basil was very distressed to see that some of the wealthy people in his city were hoarding food. They were taking the food they had and they were locking it up and saying, "This is my food," and they're hoarding it to protect their own future. Meanwhile, while these wealthy people were hoarding food, you had people who were dying in the streets of hunger. And what do you think St. Basil's response to this situation was? St. Basil said this: "Whoever has the ability to remedy the suffering of others, but chooses rather to withhold aid out of selfish motives, may properly be judged the equivalent of a murderer." And so to those people who were hoarding food while others were dying in the street, he gave the epithemion of a murderer. He said 10 years away from communion. Because the blood of these people who are dying of hunger is on your hands. St. Basil had very strong words for anybody who's in the position to offer help but refuses to. At a different time he said this. He said, "The bread that you are holding back is for the hungry. The clothes that you keep put away are for the naked. The shoes that are rotting away with disuse are for those who have none. The silver you keep buried in the earth is for the needy. You are thus guilty of injustice toward as many as you might have aided and did not." You can see that this was a person, and I read one of those quotes to President Netta earlier this week as I was putting my sermon together. She said, she remarked, St. Basil did not come to play. He was not there messing around. He was not afraid to preach the gospel. But he also provided an example. He wasn't just being harsh on people who were refusing to help, but also giving himself an example of what it means to be a Christian responding in faith to the presence of need. He founded an institution known as the Vasiliad. Have we heard of the Vasiliad? Do you know what that is? The Vasiliad was the world's first public hospital. But it wasn't only a hospital. It was also a cenona, which means a guest house, a place that people who were coming in from other areas could stay free of charge, and be fed. It was also a school. It was an orphanage. It was a homeless shelter. in addition to being the world's first public hospital. In the center of this institution, the very center of this Vasilia, was a church. Because St. Basil saw that the church's life must be concerned with providing for those who are in need. The church has to be concerned with giving aid to those who have no other source of help. So throughout the ages, the church has understood that to be a Christian, one must show concern for the poor, the hungry, the persecuted, the underprivileged. And that this concern for the poor is meaningless if it is not translated into action. We must do what we can to help. Christ's own life, if we look in the Gospels, was a life of poverty. When God became incarnate for our sake, he didn't choose to be incarnate as a wealthy ruler. He didn't choose to become incarnate as somebody who had a lot of privilege in society. Instead, God identified himself with the poor, the marginalized, and the outcast. So many of Christ's parables, as you read through the Gospel, are concerned with our response to need. What do we read about the rich man and Lazarus? The rich man who had all that he needed, and Lazarus was starving at his gates, and the rich man did nothing to help. And then the rich man finds himself in torment while Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham. What do we read also about the vineyard owner? The vineyard owner who went out and hired people to work in his crops and promised them each a denarius for their work. And the ones who came early in the day received a denarius, and the ones who didn't come and start working until the end of the day also received a denarius. What can we take away from that parable? This is a man who was concerned that all of his workers should earn a living wage. Why is that so hard for us today to have businesses and institutions who pay their workers living wages? Even in the final judgment, when we see that God separates the sheep from the goats, on what basis does he separate them? On the question of whether they help those in need. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, for I was hungry and you gave me food. The people who responded to the presence of need in creation and offered aid when aid was needed, those are the people who God embraces. But this concern of the churches is not only a concern that we see in the early church. Even in the 20th century, we know the saint, St. Maria Skobetsova. Have we heard of that saint before? Maria Skobetsova was a Russian woman. She was a nun who fled Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution and ended up in Paris. And what did she do in Paris? She ran a soup kitchen and a homeless shelter, and she was accepting people from the city of Paris, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their religion. She was accepting people into this soup kitchen she was running to give them food, to give them shelter, to give them the aid that she needed. And in fact, when the Nazis invaded Paris, St. Maria kept doing that exact same work. And because of the work she was doing, she eventually was taken by the Nazis to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Even while she was there, even in the concentration camp, she didn't stop caring for those who were in need. Wonderful. You know what she did? She helped young Jewish children escape the concentration camps by hiding them in garbage cans and sending them out of the concentration camp in disguise as if it was just the garbage being taken away. Eventually, at that concentration camp, she gave her life in the gas chambers because she was a Christian. Because she was a Christian who was not afraid to show exactly what it means to be a Christian. When I think about this question of how we as Christians are supposed to respond to the presence of need, in terms of today's society, I think there's no better example for us than the wonderful work that's done by International Orthodox Christian Charities, by IOCC. We know about IOCC? We should all, if we don't know about IOCC, learn about IOCC. They're one of I think, the best international aid organizations in the world today. And in fact, They're one of the few. Let me tell you a story. When I was in Florida just a few weeks ago, I was speaking with a priest, Father Mike Ellis, who is a priest at a big Orthodox church in Ohio. And he's a frontline worker for IOCC, which means that when there is a disaster that happens in the United States, he's one of the people that's going into those situations while everybody else is coming out. So we're going to go back to Houston for a moment. Years ago, when Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston, IOCC came into Houston and was working to help people get back on their feet, was working to help get everything cleaned up, make sure everybody was fed, make sure everybody had the medical care that they needed. And Father Michael was helping this one family, and they told him a story, and this I think highlights the difference between IOCC and some other aid organizations. There was a Baptist group in Houston that was going around to houses that had been flooded. They would go into the house and they started helping them clean up. So they came into this woman's house, and they were helping get everything cleaned up, helping get all the water out, helping get all the furniture out, all those sorts of things. While they were doing that, the minister from the church was talking with the woman who owned the house, and he was preaching to her, telling her about Jesus. And the woman said, you know, I'm a Christian myself, I'm a Catholic, and I'm very happy to be in the Catholic Church. As soon as he heard that, you know what he did? To the people who were working and cleaning up, he said, all right, let's go. And they dropped what they were doing and left. That is shameful. That is absolutely shameful. We were, when I was in Florida, Archdeacon John Crisagis was giving a talk. And something that he said that stuck with me was that as the church, as Christians, if we limit our ministry only to a particular group of people, whether that be a particular social class or a particular ethnicity or whatever it might be, if we limit our ministry only to one particular group of people, we are betraying the church and we are betraying the gospel. That's not what IOCC does. IOCC goes into a situation where there's need, and they respond to that need regardless of a person's ethnicity, regardless of a person's religion, regardless of any of that. It really is no strings attached. You've heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, that's not true with IOCC. So I bring them up only as an example of the fact that this intense concern for the poor, which is an integral part of our faith, is something that is present with us to this very day. And so, I'm going to come back now to that document from the Patriarchate last year I told you about. And I read in that document echoes of St. Basil, because St. Basil was so unflinching and so unafraid to preach the Christian faith with all of its implications. And listen to what this document from 2020 from the Patriarchate says. Christian love teaches us to give our brothers, excuse me, this is the wrong quote. Excuse me. Now I got it. This document from 2020 says, it is impossible for the church truly to follow Christ or to make him present to the world if it fails to place absolute concern for the poor and disadvantaged at the very center of its moral, religious, and spiritual life. The pursuit of social justice and civil equity, provision for the poor and shelter for the homeless, protection for the weak, welcome for the displaced, and assistance for the disabled is not merely an ethos that the church recommends for the sake of a comfortable conscience, but it is a necessary means of salvation, the indispensable path to union with God in Christ. And to fail in these responsibilities is to invite condemnation before the judgment seat of God. That, again, is an example of being unflinching and unafraid to preach the gospel with all of its sometimes uncomfortable implications, uncomfortable ramifications. So the church has never lost this fervor of its concern for those who are in need. The church has never lost this sense that as Christians, we are not doing our duty unless we are caring for any person that we are in a position to care for. And so, let us, as Christians today, take the example of the early church, take the example of St. Basil, take the example of St. Maria Scopizzolo, take the example of IOCC, and let us make that example our own experience by responding and doing what we can whenever we are confronted with the presence of need in our world. Amen.